Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life, like you're performing in a play where everyone knows their lines except you? There's a hollow ache in your chest, a persistent sense that something fundamental is missing, even when everything on the surface appears fine. Carl Jung, the revolutionary Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the depths of human consciousness, discovered something profound about this emptiness that haunts so many of us. He realized that what we call emptiness isn't actually the absence of something. It's the presence of everything we've refused to acknowledge about ourselves. In the next 40 minutes, I'm going to share with you the 5 psychological reasons why you feel empty inside, according to Jung's groundbreaking work. You'll discover why your attempts to fill this void with external achievements, relationships, or possessions have failed. And more importantly, you'll understand the hidden gifts that this emptiness is trying to reveal. This isn't just another self-help discussion. This is an invitation to meet the parts of yourself you've been running from your entire life. Jung believed that our greatest wounds carry our greatest potential for healing, and by the end of this exploration, you'll see how your emptiness might actually be the key to finding your authentic self. The first reason you feel empty inside stems from what Jung called the rejection of your shadow. Imagine for a moment that you're standing in bright sunlight. Behind you, cast by your own body, is a dark silhouette, your shadow. You can't escape it, you can't destroy it, and yet most people spend their entire lives pretending it doesn't exist. Jung discovered that we all have a psychological shadow, comprised of the parts of ourselves we've deemed unacceptable, shameful, or dangerous. Consider Sarah, a successful lawyer who prides herself on being rational, controlled, and professional. Since childhood, she learned that anger was inappropriate, especially for girls. So she buried her rage, her wildness, her fierce protective instincts deep in her unconscious. Now, at 35, she feels inexplicably empty despite her achievements. She's cut herself off from her fire, her passion, her authentic power. The emptiness she feels is the space left behind by the rejected parts of herself. Jung understood that when we banish aspects of our personality to the shadow, we don't eliminate them. We simply lose conscious access to them. It's like cutting off circulation to a limb. The limb doesn't disappear, but it becomes numb, lifeless. The shadow contains not just our negative traits, but also our repressed gifts, our unlived potential, our creative fire. When we reject our shadow, we reject vital aspects of our own life force. The psychological consequence of shadow rejection is profound. We become half people, living partial lives. We develop what Jung called a persona, a mask we wear to be acceptable to others and to ourselves. But the persona, no matter how polished, can never provide the deep satisfaction that comes from wholeness. The emptiness you feel is your psyche's way of calling you back to completeness, demanding that you reclaim the disowned parts of yourself. The second reason for inner emptiness lies in what Jung termed unconscious projection. Picture a movie theater where instead of watching the film on the screen, you become convinced that the characters are actually in the theater with you. This is what happens when we project our unconscious content onto the external world. We see our own unlived life, our own rejected aspects, our own unfulfilled potential in other people, and then we either idolize them or despise them for carrying what we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. Think about Marcus, who feels profoundly empty in his corporate job. He scrolls through social media, watching travel bloggers living adventurous lives, and feels a mixture of envy and longing. What Marcus doesn't realize is that these travelers represent his own projected anima, his inner feminine side that craves beauty, adventure, and emotional richness. Instead of recognizing these as aspects of himself that he's neglected, he projects them onto others and then feels empty because he believes these qualities exist only outside himself. Jung observed that we're constantly projecting our unconscious onto our relationships, our work, our dreams of the future. We fall in love with people who carry our projected anima or animus, the contrasexual aspects of our psyche. We chase careers that represent our unlived potential. We admire qualities in others that are actually dormant within ourselves. But projection creates a terrible emptiness because we're always seeking outside ourselves what can only be found within. The psychological impact is a life lived in constant seeking but never finding. We become eternal consumers of experiences, relationships, and achievements, hoping they will fill the void. But Jung knew that projection keeps us forever hungry, because we're trying to feed ourselves with shadows and reflections instead of the real nourishment that comes from integrating our own completeness. Before we continue deeper into this psychological landscape, I want to acknowledge something. If you're feeling a recognition in these words, if something is stirring in your awareness, then this exploration is already working. Jung believed that consciousness itself is curative. The very act of becoming aware of these patterns begins to transform them. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing to continue this journey of self-discovery together. The comments below are often filled with profound insights from others walking this same path of awakening to their whole selves. The third reason you feel empty inside emerges from what Jung called the undeveloped anima or animus. These are perhaps the most misunderstood aspects of his psychology, yet they hold the key to understanding why so many people feel fundamentally incomplete. The anima is the unconscious feminine aspect in men, while the animus is the unconscious masculine aspect in women. But Jung's insight goes far deeper than gender roles. He was describing the psychological necessity of integrating opposite qualities within ourselves to achieve wholeness. Consider David, a successful businessman who has spent 40 years developing his masculine qualities: logic, achievement, competition, control. He's excellent at solving problems, and conquering challenges. Yet he feels profoundly empty, especially in his relationships. What David has never developed is his anima, his capacity for receptivity, intuition, emotional depth, and creative expression. He's become overdeveloped in one direction and completely underdeveloped in another. Jung discovered that the anima and animus are not just theoretical concepts, but living psychological realities that demand recognition. When we fail to develop these contrasexual aspects, we experience what he called a loss of soul. We become psychologically lopsided, like trying to walk with only one leg or breathe with only one lung. The emptiness we feel is the cry of our undeveloped psychological functions, demanding attention and integration. For women, an undeveloped animus might manifest as feeling powerless, unable to assert themselves, or constantly seeking masculine validation from external sources. For men, an undeveloped anima might appear as emotional numbness, inability to connect deeply with others, or a constant restless seeking for something they can't name. In both cases, the emptiness points toward the need to develop the neglected aspects of the psyche. Jung believed that middle age often brings an anima or animus crisis precisely because the psyche demands this integration. The career-focused man suddenly feels empty despite his success because his anima is demanding recognition. The relationship-focused woman suddenly feels lost because her animus is calling for development. This emptiness isn't pathology, it's the psyche's intelligence guiding us toward wholeness. The fourth reason for inner emptiness stems from what Jung identified as disconnection from the collective unconscious and archetypal energies. Human beings are not isolated individuals, but participants in a vast ocean of shared psychological patterns that Jung called the collective unconscious. When we cut ourselves off from this deeper layer of meaning, we experience what modern psychology might call existential emptiness. But Jung understood it as archetypal starvation. Imagine Lisa, a marketing executive who feels successful by conventional standards, but experiences a gnawing emptiness that no achievement can fill. She's unknowingly disconnected from the archetypal energies that give life meaning: the mother, the wise woman, the creator, the healer. She's living a purely personal existence without connection to the transpersonal patterns that have guided human meaning-making for millennia. Jung observed that modern life often strips us of archetypal connection. We live in nuclear families instead of tribes, work in corporations instead of meaningful vocations, consume entertainment instead of participating in ritual and ceremony. We've gained technological advancement but lost psychological and spiritual nourishment. The emptiness many people feel is actually archetypal hunger, a deep longing to connect with something larger than their personal ego concerns. This disconnection manifests as a feeling that life is meaningless, that we're just going through motions without deeper purpose. Jung called this the spiritual problem of modern man. We've become over-identified with our personal consciousness and lost touch with the wisdom and energy of the collective psyche. We feel empty because we're trying to live on the thin air of personal achievement instead of breathing the rich atmosphere of archetypal meaning. The psychological consequence is a life that feels hollow despite external success. We might achieve everything we thought we wanted, yet still feel profoundly unsatisfied because we haven't connected with the deeper sources of meaning that flow through the collective unconscious. Jung believed that genuine fulfillment comes not just from personal development, but from finding our place in the larger patterns of human experience. The fifth, and perhaps most fundamental reason for inner emptiness, is what Jung called ego inflation and the failure of individuation. Most people live their entire lives identified with their ego, the conscious, rational part of the personality that thinks it's running the show. But Jung understood that the ego is just one small part of the total psyche, like a cork floating on the vast ocean of the unconscious. When we mistake the ego for our entire self, we experience a profound emptiness because we're living as a fragment instead of as a whole being. Consider Michael, who has built his entire identity around being successful, intelligent, and in control. His ego has become inflated. He believes he is nothing more than his achievements and conscious intentions. But this inflation creates a terrible vulnerability because it's built on such a narrow foundation. When challenges arise that threaten his ego identity, he doesn't just feel disappointed. He feels like he's dissolving because he has no connection to the deeper self that Jung knew was the true center of the personality. Jung distinguished between the ego and the self, the ego being our conscious identity, and the self being the totality of our being, including all the unconscious contents. Individuation, Jung's term for the process of psychological development, involves the ego learning to serve the self rather than trying to be the self. When we live from ego inflation, we're constantly trying to maintain an image, control outcomes, and prove our worth. This is exhausting and ultimately futile, because the ego was never meant to carry the full weight of our existence. The emptiness of ego inflation feels like being an imposter in your own life. You might achieve everything you set out to achieve, yet feel like you're living someone else's story. This is because the ego goals we pursue are often borrowed from society, family, or cultural expectations, rather than emerging from our authentic self. We feel empty because we're living a life that looks successful from the outside, but isn't connected to our true nature. Jung observed that the individuation process often begins with a breakdown of ego inflation. The carefully constructed identity starts to crack, and through these cracks, the light of the self begins to shine through. What feels like failure or crisis is actually the beginning of real psychological development. The emptiness serves as a call to adventure, inviting us to discover who we really are beyond our ego identities. Now we arrive at the deepest layer of Jung's insight about emptiness, and this is where everything we've discussed converges into a profound revelation. The emptiness you feel isn't actually a problem to be solved, it's a doorway to be walked through. Jung discovered that what we experience as psychological emptiness is often the space being created for our authentic self to emerge. Just as a seed must crack open for the plant to grow, our old identity structures must become empty for our true nature to unfold. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of Jung's psychology, yet it's the key to understanding why conventional solutions to emptiness rarely work. We try to fill the emptiness with achievements, relationships, possessions, experiences, or beliefs. But Jung realized that the emptiness itself is sacred. It's the fertile void from which genuine selfhood emerges. In alchemical terms, it's the nigredo, the necessary darkness and dissolution that precedes transformation. Think about the caterpillar in its chrysalis. There's a stage where the caterpillar literally dissolves into what biologists call soup, a complete breakdown of its previous form. From the outside, this might look like death or failure, but it's actually the necessary emptying that allows the butterfly to emerge. Jung saw psychological emptiness in the same way, not as pathology, but as preparation for metamorphosis. This emptiness asks us to sit with uncertainty, to tolerate not knowing who we are outside of our familiar roles and identities. It invites us to question everything we thought we knew about ourselves and life. This is terrifying for the ego, which wants security and predictability, but it's essential for the self, which seeks authenticity and wholeness. Jung believed that the modern world has lost touch with this wisdom about emptiness. Ancient spiritual traditions understood that periods of darkness, confusion, and emptiness were necessary stages of growth. The dark night of the soul wasn't seen as depression, but as initiation. The vision quest required going into the wilderness and sitting with uncertainty until vision emerged. But our contemporary culture pathologizes emptiness and rushes to fill it rather than understanding its transformative purpose. The psychological consequence of resisting this sacred emptiness is that we remain stuck in psychological adolescence, constantly seeking external validation and stimulation rather than developing the capacity to generate meaning and satisfaction from within. We become what Jung called provisional people, always waiting for real life to begin, always seeking the next achievement or experience to finally feel complete. But when we learn to work with emptiness rather than against it, something remarkable happens. We begin to discover that we are far more than we ever imagined. The space created by the dissolution of our false selves becomes the womb for our authentic being. We stop trying to fill the emptiness and start learning to inhabit it consciously. And in that inhabitation, we discover the inexhaustible richness of our own being. Jung called this process the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites until a new level of consciousness emerges. Instead of choosing between fullness and emptiness, we learn to embrace both. We discover that true fullness includes emptiness, just as true light includes darkness. We stop trying to be someone and start learning to simply be. This is where Jung's understanding of individuation becomes revolutionary. Most personal development approaches try to build up the ego, to make us more successful, confident, or positive. But Jung understood that real development often requires the opposite, a willingness to let the ego be empty so that the self can fill the space. This doesn't mean becoming passive or nihilistic. It means developing what Jung called active imagination, the capacity to consciously participate in the emergence of our authentic being. The emptiness you feel might be your psyche's way of clearing space for parts of yourself that have never had room to emerge. Maybe you've been so busy being successful that you've never explored your creative depths. Maybe you've been so focused on caring for others that you've never developed your own voice. Maybe you've been so committed to being rational that you've never experienced your intuitive wisdom. Jung observed that the second half of life often brings this kind of emptiness because the psyche is preparing for a fundamental shift in orientation. The first half of life is typically about ego development, establishing an identity, building a career, creating relationships. But the second half is about what Jung called meaning-making, discovering our deeper purpose and connecting with the transpersonal dimensions of existence. This transition often feels like a loss of everything that previously gave life meaning. Jung called it the afternoon of life, and observed that it requires completely different psychological skills than the morning. We must learn to value being over doing, depth over breadth, wisdom over knowledge. We must develop what he called the religious attitude, not necessarily belief in a particular doctrine, but recognition of mystery and reverence for the unknown. The emptiness serves as a kind of psychological death that precedes psychological rebirth. Just as physical death clears the way for new life in nature's cycles, psychological emptiness clears the way for new aspects of ourselves to emerge. This is why Jung was fascinated by mythology and fairy tales. They contain wisdom about these transformative processes that our rational minds have forgotten. Consider the myth of Persephone's descent into the underworld. She's kidnapped by Hades and taken into the realm of the dead, where she must remain for part of each year. From the ego's perspective, this is pure tragedy, a loss of innocence and connection to the upper world. But from the self's perspective, Persephone's journey into the underworld transforms her from a naive maiden into a wise queen who bridges the conscious and unconscious realms. Your emptiness might be your own descent into the underworld of the psyche. It might feel like loss, but it's actually an initiation into a deeper level of being. The darkness you're experiencing isn't the opposite of light. It's the pregnant darkness from which new light will emerge. Jung understood that consciousness itself emerges from the unconscious, just as the dawn emerges from the darkness of night. This is why trying to fix emptiness with external solutions often backfires. It's like trying to skip the winter and go straight to spring. The psychological winter of emptiness serves an essential function. It allows old patterns to die so that new ones can be born. It forces us to develop inner resources rather than relying on external stimulation. It teaches us to find meaning in being rather than just in doing. Jung observed that people who learn to work with their emptiness often develop what he called cultural attitude. They become sources of wisdom and creativity for their communities. They've learned to mine the depths of their own being and bring up treasures that can benefit others. Their emptiness becomes a gift, not just to themselves, but to the world. But this transformation requires what Jung called the courage to be disliked, the willingness to live authentically even when it challenges others' expectations. As you begin to fill from within rather than seeking external validation, you might find that some relationships and situations no longer fit. This can be disorienting, but it's also liberating. You're no longer dependent on others to make you feel whole because you're developing that capacity within yourself. The process also requires developing what Jung called psychological courage, the willingness to face whatever emerges from the unconscious without immediately judging or rejecting it. As you create space for your authentic self to emerge, you might discover aspects of yourself that surprise or even shock you. You might find creative abilities you never knew you had, or passionate feelings you've been suppressing, or wisdom that seems to come from beyond your personal experience. Jung believed that this process of befriending our own depths was not just personally healing, but culturally necessary. He saw the psychological splitting and emptiness of modern people as symptoms of a collective crisis. When individuals learn to integrate their own wholeness, they contribute to the healing of the collective consciousness. Your personal journey through emptiness becomes a service to the larger human community. This is perhaps the most profound aspect of Jung's understanding, that individual psychological development and collective healing are intimately connected. As you learn to embrace your own emptiness and allow your authentic self to emerge, you become part of the solution to humanity's psychological and spiritual crisis. You stop projecting your unlived life onto others and start living it yourself. You stop seeking saviors and start becoming a source of wisdom and strength. The emptiness you feel isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something is trying to be born through you. It's your psyche's way of creating space for aspects of yourself that have been waiting in the wings of consciousness, ready to emerge when conditions are right. Jung called these waiting aspects the seeds of the self, potentials that exist within the unconscious, ready to sprout when the ground of consciousness has been properly prepared. This understanding completely reframes the experience of emptiness. Instead of seeing it as depression or failure, we can recognize it as a necessary stage of psychological development. Instead of rushing to fill it with distractions, we can learn to sit with it consciously, allowing it to teach us what it has to offer. Instead of seeing it as evidence of our inadequacy, we can understand it as a sign of our readiness for the next stage of growth. Jung observed that this process often accelerates during times of crisis or transition. Loss of a job, end of a relationship, death of a loved one, or even a global pandemic can strip away the external structures we've used to define ourselves, revealing the emptiness that was always there beneath the surface. These experiences, while painful, can become opportunities for profound transformation if we understand how to work with them psychologically. The key is developing what Jung called the transcendent attitude, the ability to hold paradox without immediately resolving it. Instead of choosing between emptiness and fullness, we learn to experience both simultaneously. We discover that we can feel empty and full at the same time, lost and found, broken and whole. This paradoxical awareness opens us to dimensions of experience that the either-or mind cannot access. As we learn to inhabit our emptiness consciously, we often discover that it's not actually empty at all. It's full of subtle energies, incipient potentials, and what Jung called the transcendent function. We begin to sense that we're not isolated individuals, but part of something much larger, the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. Our personal emptiness becomes a doorway into transpersonal meaning. This is where Jung's psychology intersects with the world's wisdom traditions. The Buddhist concept of emptiness, the Christian dark night of the soul, the shamanic dismemberment and rebirth, all point to the same essential process of letting go of false identity to discover true being. Jung's genius was to translate these perennial insights into psychological language that could speak to modern people who might be suspicious of traditional religious frameworks. The practical implication is that working with emptiness requires developing what Jung called active patience, the ability to wait without passive resignation, to trust the process without forcing outcomes. It means learning to distinguish between the ego's panic about emptiness and the self's deeper wisdom about the necessity of dissolution and renewal. It means developing practices that help us stay present with uncertainty rather than rushing toward premature closure. Jung recommended what he called active imagination as one of the primary tools for working with psychological emptiness. This involves consciously dialoguing with the images, feelings, and impulses that emerge from the unconscious, treating them as messengers from the deeper self rather than as problems to be eliminated. Through active imagination, we can begin to understand what our emptiness is trying to communicate and what it's preparing us for. He also emphasized the importance of paying attention to dreams during periods of emptiness. Dreams often compensate for the conscious attitude, showing us what we're missing or preparing us for what's coming. During times of psychological emptiness, dreams often become particularly vivid and meaningful, offering guidance for the individuation process. Perhaps, most importantly, Jung understood that working with emptiness is not a solitary endeavor. While the experience itself might feel isolating, the process of integration requires what he called the witness, someone who can hold space for our transformation without trying to fix or change us. This might be a therapist, a spiritual director, a wise friend, or a supportive community. The presence of a witness helps us stay present with our experience rather than getting lost in it. As we near the end of this exploration, I want to return to where we began, with the recognition that your emptiness is not a problem, but a profound intelligence. It's your psyche's way of calling you home to yourself, of creating space for parts of you that have been waiting in the wings to emerge. It's an invitation to step into a deeper relationship with the mystery of your own being. Jung believed that the goal of life was not happiness, but meaning, not the fulfillment of ego desires, but the realization of the self. From this perspective, emptiness serves meaning by forcing us to question our assumptions, to dig deeper than surface satisfactions, to discover sources of fulfillment that don't depend on external circumstances. The emptiness you feel might be preparing you for a completely different way of being in the world. Maybe you're being called to express creativity you've never allowed yourself to explore. Maybe you're being prepared to serve in ways you never imagined. Maybe you're being invited to develop spiritual capacities that require the ego to step aside. The space being created by emptiness is making room for possibilities that couldn't emerge while you were tightly identified with your current self-concept. This doesn't mean the process is easy or comfortable. Jung never minimized the difficulty of psychological transformation. He knew that growth often feels like death to the aspects of ourselves that must be left behind. But he also knew that resisting this process leads to what he called a provisional life, a life lived in the waiting room of authentic existence. The choice you face is not whether to experience emptiness. If you're here listening to these words, that choice has already been made by forces deeper than your conscious will. The choice is whether to resist the emptiness or learn to work with it consciously, whether to fill it with distractions or allow it to teach you what it knows, whether to see it as failure or recognize it as preparation for a more authentic way of being. Jung's final insight about emptiness was perhaps his most radical, that it's not something to be overcome, but something to be integrated. The goal is not to eliminate emptiness, but to develop a conscious relationship with it, to learn to move fluidly between fullness and emptiness, expansion and contraction, knowing and not knowing, to become comfortable with the paradox of being simultaneously empty and full, lost and found, broken and whole. This integration transforms emptiness from an enemy into an ally. Instead of fighting against it, we learn to dance with it. Instead of being victimized by it, we discover how to consciously participate in the renewal it offers. We develop what Jung called the religious attitude, not necessarily belief in a particular God, but reverence for the mystery and intelligence of the psyche itself. The emptiness you feel is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of a new chapter. It's your psyche's way of clearing the stage for a more authentic performance. It's life itself asking you to step into a deeper relationship with your own becoming. The question is not how to fill the emptiness, but how to learn the dance of emptiness and fullness that Jung recognized as the rhythm of psychological wholeness. Your emptiness is calling you to become who you really are, beneath all the roles and identities you've accumulated. It's inviting you to discover the inexhaustible source of meaning and satisfaction that exists within your own being. It's asking you to trust the intelligence of your own transformation, even when you can't see where it's leading. This is Jung's gift to anyone struggling with inner emptiness, The recognition that you're not broken, you're breaking open, you're not failing, you're being prepared for a success that your current self can't even imagine. You're not losing yourself. You're finding yourself in the only place you were ever going to find yourself, in the depths of your own being, in the embrace of your own becoming, in the sacred space where emptiness and fullness reveal themselves to be two faces of the same profound mystery. The journey through emptiness is ultimately a journey home, not to where you came from, but to who you've always been beneath the surface of your conscious awareness. Jung called this the return to the self, and he believed it was the most important journey any human being could undertake. Your emptiness is not evidence that you're lost, it's evidence that you're finally ready to be found.